So the unprecedented federal intervention without invoking the Insurrection Act raises complex legal and political issues, while Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth warns that active duty Marines stand ready if unrest continues. Now, to unpack the implications and to talk this through with us, we are joined by Justin Thomas Russell, the Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center, joining us from Massachusetts. Thanks for being here with us on the program. And before we get to the National Guard and the legalities of things, what is your assessment of the protests themselves? And do they have any support when it comes to public opinion?
That's a great question. The reality is, yes, in Southern California, there's a lot of support for the protests, and the scope of the protests has been very simple. The protests are that they are creating a state of fear. ICE's workplace enforcement actions are creating basically a state of fear on a very key segment of the workforce, particularly the manual labor workforce that's in Southern California. This is a very, very sensitive issue, particularly with the fact that, again, this was kind of sparked off. Some are saying it was sparked off because there was about to be an ICE raid at a Home Depot in the Paramount section just outside of downtown LA, which it turns out was not the case. But that Home Depot lot is where a lot of general contractors get their day laborers to help rebuild parts of Los Angeles, homes, buildings, infrastructure that were affected by the wildfires last year, or earlier this year rather. And that's that's something that not a lot of people are thinking about nationwide when we talk about the immigration issue. As far as the scope, 3,000 people is not a lot, and for Donald Trump to activate 2,000 National Guard troops to respond to a protest which was largely peaceful of 3,000 seems excessive.
Yeah, let's come on to that. Donald Trump's decision to federalize and launch the National Guard. Is this pretty significant? It's been called something that's escalating tensions and provocative by the governor of California, Gavin Newsom.
Absolutely. Governor Newsom is correct. And just because you have the power to do so does not necessarily mean it's a good idea to invoke that power. We're seeing that right now. Let's be clear. The National Guard is under the direct command of the governor of California, in this case, Gavin Newsom. And what Donald Trump has done is something that has not really been done since 1992. Ironically, the last time that happened was in Los Angeles after the Rodney King riots, where the president invoked the Insurrection Act to bring in National Guard troops to support civil law enforcement authorities in the enforcement of and maintaining peace. What we're seeing now, though, however, is a completely different situation. You're talking about one of the most highly trained, one of the most highly visible police departments in the world, the LAPD, and they have a huge, huge capability in civil enforcement and civil unrest, interaction. The fact that Donald Trump thinks that he needs to support them by putting in National Guard troops to support them, I think, is highly ludicrous. He activated as many National Guard troops almost as were people that were protesting. That seems a little ludicrous. What this comes across as Donald Trump trying to flex his muscles and show off, and it's not necessary, and all it's going to do is add fuel to a fire.
Of course, it was a very different situation 30-odd years ago, back in 1992. Would that have been George Bush Sr. would have been president then during the LA riots before Clinton came in. So he did the same thing. And this seems like a very different situation. The LAPD has gone some to try and change its relationship with the public in that time. So why do you think Trump has done this?
As I said before, it's very simple. This is a flexing of muscle. This is I have the power. I'm going to show you who's boss. And he's it's a very unwise move. And on top of the fact, his advisors should be telling him this is not a good idea. Traditionally, Republicans have been very much a states' rights kind of political party. This is something that, we should not invoke a larger federal presence than necessary, and Donald Trump's doing the exact opposite of that. The other thing we have to look at here is we just heard that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is saying that Marines up at Camp Pendleton are on high alert, ready to deploy. Somebody better tell Pete Hegseth to pump the brakes on that, because he is now teetering with violations of the Stafford Act and Posse Comitatus, and now you're getting into legal battles that are going to be about this. This is turning into a huge quagmire that does not need to happen, and it's all because Donald Trump wants to be kind of a boss guy, and he's looking silly in the global community.
But the federalization of the National Guard is within Trump's legal power, would you say, even though, as you were saying, what Pete Hegseth is saying, is that the law you were talking about where members of the armed forces cannot be used against American citizens on American soil? Is that the law you're talking about?
Correct. What we have to look at here is actually there's two very different distinctions. When we talk about the National Guard, which is different from the military reserve, the National Guard, the citizen soldiers, the citizen militia of each state is under the direct command of the governor of each state and territory. In this case, the National Guard is a component, a defensive component, and a civil defense component of the state of California, with ties and direct link to the chain of command authority to the Pentagon, to Washington, and ultimately the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States. But ultimately, that is something that has been invoked very rarely, where the president has taken over the authority and stepped over the chain of command in the National Guard, in this case with Gavin Newsom, to take over and deploy National Guard. When we talk about the military, the DOD under the Secretary of Defense, that's where this gets. Any Marine troops deployed on U.S. soil to do civil enforcement or civil defense is going to be a violation of Posse Comitatus. It's going to be a violation of the Stafford Act, where it says you cannot utilize unless you invoke and this is the loophole that Donald Trump is banking on, the Insurrection Act, which is going to be fought in courts all day long. But traditionally, we have not put military personnel in the streets of a city, an American city, to enforce laws. It's a bad idea. It's a bad look. It just looks like a dictatorship.
Well,
that's the problem.
Just broadening out a little bit, what does this mean for the conversation, the broader national debate on immigration, ICE, the behavior of ICE, and also for public order? Do you think Trump will have quite a bit of support for what he's doing?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't think we have an answer yet. Look, let me just be clear. As somebody who enforced immigration laws for several years early on in my career, I know the difficulty that the officers at ICE, at Customs and Border Protection, and even at the state and local level have to deal with. It is a tricky situation. Immigration policy has been a third rail politically for decades. Nobody wants to touch it because it gets people elected. We just saw that in 2024. There's been several attempts to fix immigration law. That being said, the only way that this is going to change the dynamic, because people on the right, the MAGA world people, are going to say, look, they're here illegally, which they are. But the Democrats are saying, look, we need them. They're a key component of our economy, which they are. But nobody wants to seem to come up with the law, which is what the Supreme Court has said, is fix the problem legally through laws created by Congress and supported and enforced by the executive branch. They haven't done that. And that's a big problem. The one thing I want to point out here is our economy relies on undocumented workers, whether we like it or not. We have not fixed the problem in over 40 years, but unless we want to start paying, $20 for a head of lettuce or $15 for a pack of a dozen eggs, we need a migratory workforce to help keep this economy where it's at and keep the economy growing. Nobody wants to talk about that. That is like a taboo subject, and that is something nobody wants to realize. Once it starts hitting Americans in the pocketbook, when we start seeing food prices, costs of building homes, costs of maintaining, the cost of what would be a $50 a night hotel room going up to $120 a night, when we start hitting the pocketbooks of everyday Americans, that's when people are going to take immigration law seriously and we'll make some changes. What we're seeing in LA, what we're seeing now is just kabuki dance.
Okay. Well, it just seems a few nights ago we were laughing about the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and a few nights later, here we are with a situation a whole lot more serious, and we'll continue to see what happens over the next 24 to 48 hours. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Russell, for your insights as always. It's great to have you on here at Q News.